one of the things that Pharisees do is they'll see a passage like this. Jesus said, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones." And they'll immediately start to think of the ways that they don't despise them, so that they don't have to be challenged by it. But what pure in heart, hungering and thirsting for righteousness people will do is they'll look to the passage and they'll say, in what ways do I? In what ways do I despise them? That way I can change and I can grow. So I want to get a good understanding of what that means today. First of all, we need to ask, who are little ones? What does Jesus mean by that? Is he talking just about children or a different group? And then specifically, who are these little ones? What group of little ones does he have in mind? And then secondly, we need to ask, what does it mean to despise them? And how would we go about not despising them? So for answering the first question, who are the little ones? Earlier in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever receives you receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me." So he's talking, they're going to go out into the world and evangelize, and they're going to hopefully be received because they're a prophet. They're hopefully going to be received as righteous people because they're righteous people. And then notice in verse 42, he says, "And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple," because he, a little one, is a disciple. So here, little ones refers to disciples, not just children. All right? So that's what little ones meant there. Now, notice Jesus gives really the same idea in Matthew chapter 18. And these couple verses that I'm going to show will lead up to verse 10. So as you can see, this is Matthew 18:3. And notice what he says. He says, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then whoever receives one such child in my name receives me." Doesn't that sound a lot like what he said here? Whoever receives you, disciples, receives me. Whoever receives one such child. Well, what such child? Well, one of these disciples who'd made themselves like children, who'd humbled themselves like children. So here he has in mind that these are disciples. One such child. He calls them children, but notice the contrast in verse 6. "But whoever causes one of these little ones," see, "who believe in me," so that's a disciple, "who believe in me to sin." So this isn't just a child, because these people can go out and they can deliberately sin against God. And then he gives a warning. He said it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. All right, that's verses 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now look at verse 7. "Woe to the world for temptations to sin." So over here, he's saying, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. And he's saying, don't do that. And now he's saying, woe to the world for temptations to sin. All right? So we're talking about people who've been tempted. And then now if you go right back to Matthew 18, he says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones." He's talking about little ones are disciples, but these little ones that he has in mind are lost sheep. In fact, as we're going to look at in just a moment in verse 12, he's going to talk about some sheep who've gone astray and what God would want done and then what we would want to do. So little ones are lost sheep. These little ones, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Little ones are disciples. These little ones are lost sheep. Those are the ones Jesus has in mind. Those are the ones Jesus specifically in this instance is saying don't despise them. So what would it mean to despise lost sheep? People who once were a part of the fold but have fallen away. sometimes in the Bible, the most fundamental point under which everything else is undergirded is given last. And this is an example of that. Notice in verse 14 down here, Jesus said, so that means therefore, it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. That's the conclusion Jesus wants to bring us to. Therefore, it isn't the will of God that one of these little ones should perish. That point about God, about the character of God, implicitly describes why verse 10 should be so incredibly important to us. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. Why? Because the Father who is in heaven doesn't want them to perish. Okay? Now, before we can fully understand what it would mean not to despise them, then we need to ask in what ways Jesus proves verse 14, that it is not the will of God that these little ones should perish. Well, Jesus gives three evidences. Number one, in verse 10, after he gave the command, he said, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for, that means because, for I tell you that in heaven, their angels, whose angels? Little ones, always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Their angels, that means they have some angels, little ones, vulnerable disciples who could stumble. They have angels assigned to them, not like a guardian angel that's going to keep them from hurting their foot, but some kind of a spiritual strength behind the scenes in the heavenly places, kind of like what Paul talks about in the book of Ephesians. So, God has granted angels. God granted angels. That's the first evidence that would prove what Jesus says down here in verse 14, that it is not the will of the Father that one of these little ones should perish. Okay? Second evidence that Jesus gives. Jesus said, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And this is not just a generic parable that's meant to describe human beings. Everything Jesus is saying in these verses leads to the truth in verse 14 that the Father doesn't want little ones to perish. So when we see this person here who's going in search, we ought to see that as God. God is going in search of them. God, what Jesus is saying, God seeks lost sheep. God doesn't just throw them away. God doesn't just no longer care about them. All right? And then the third evidence that proves what Jesus says here, that it is not the will of the Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. The third evidence is given in verse 13, where he says, and if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices. He rejoices over it. More so than over the 99 that never went astray. So, God rejoices when lost sheep come home. All of these points, God has granted angels to little ones to keep them from going astray. God seeks them when they do go astray. God rejoices greatly over them when they do come home All of those points prove what Jesus says here. Therefore, it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Now, understanding that and Jesus proving that, that is what causes us to find all of our context up here in verse 10 when Jesus says, now see that you don't despise one of these little ones. Well, we don't despise these little ones because the Father who is in heaven doesn't despise these little ones. And in what ways did God not despise them? He granted them angels. He sought after them. He rejoices when they come home. So in what ways do we not despise them? Well, we don't despise them when we... let me write this out here. Here's one way we can avoid despising them. Before they ever go astray, we can encourage them. Encourage and strengthen. Before they ever go astray, just like God gives them angels to encourage them in the heavenly places, in the spiritual realm that's invisible to us, we can encourage and strengthen them. But if they do go astray, just like God seeks after them, we seek them. Seek them wholeheartedly, because Jesus said we would leave the more established Christians and just go after them. And then number 3, just like God rejoices when they come home, we make it a big deal. Make a celebration. Make them feel good when they come back. Show them how much we love them, and how much they were loved, and how glad we are that they're home. Those are ways that we don't despise them. So when we fail to encourage and strengthen young disciples who need us, then we despise them. When we do not seek them wholeheartedly, but we sort of apathetically think, well, they're gone, no worries, then we despise them. When we don't make a celebration when they come back and we just act like we couldn't care less, then we despise them. Let's go forward and let's do as God does. Let's let it not be our will that they should perish. Let's not despise them. In other words, let's love them and seek them and strengthen and establish them. Have a blessed day.